presentation. So welcome to our session, Leaving No One Behind. We are really excited to have Marianne Scobie, the Deputy CEO from Glasgow Disability Alliance, joining us today. Glasgow Disability Alliance is a support organisation led by disabled people for disabled people, and Marianne, as a disabled person herself, has a wealth of expertise and lived experience as well as professional experience in how best to face the many and tackle the many barriers people with disabilities facing when trying to participate in everyday life. So today we're talking, and she will be sharing some best practice with us about how to make those online spaces and meetings more accessible, and what we need to think about when we're setting those spaces up. And one of the reasons we thought this might be a good session was basically because we struggled with that ourselves, and we didn't get it right in the beginning, and we had to learn. People in our network had to tell us when things weren't accessible for them. So yes, I'm really excited to have and hear and learn more about this. So over to you, Marianne.
Okay. Thanks very much, everybody, and thanks especially for giving up a really lovely day to come and be on Zoom. I really appreciate it, especially if you're in Scotland, because it's not been very nice in Scotland the past few days, and it's absolutely glorious today. So welcome, everybody. I'm just going to give a short overview of GDA and what we've been up to the past couple of months during lockdown, and then we're going to split you into some discussion groups so that you can introduce yourselves to each other and have a think about some of the things that you might want to ask today, or just sort of share your own experiences. So I'm going to hopefully... Oh, I'm sorry, it's still wet and miserable in some parts of Scotland. I apologise. In Glasgow, it's lovely. I can see that in the chat. So, okay, so hopefully you can see a Holden slide just now. Is that, if somebody could nod and let me know that you can see that, that would be fantastic. Thank you. So as I said, my name's Marianne Scobie. I'm the Depute CEO of Glasgow Disability Alliance. And I realise that depute's not a word that's used in England very much, but it basically is the same word as deputy. It's not spelt wrong, it's just the word that we tend to use in Scotland. Oh. Oops. Here we go. So Glasgow Disability Alliance is a disabled people's organisation. It's run by disabled people for disabled people, and we've been around for about 20 years. Had a slow but sure start, but we've been a funded organisation for about 13 years. We've got around 5,000 disabled members in and around Glasgow, and we offer free membership for disabled people aged 11 upwards, and our oldest members are 100 and something. We're a pan-impairment and self-identifying disabled people's organisation, and what that means is that we support disabled people with any and every type of disability, condition, impairment, and people with mental health conditions, people who have physical impairments, people who are deaf, and so on. So basically everybody and anybody, and also older people who may have long-term conditions, may not necessarily identify themselves as disabled people, but they are disabled within the realms of the Equality Act. So we do have many disabled people who, as I said, don't necessarily define themselves that way, but they are in terms of the law. And we don't necessarily ask people what their condition is. We ask them if they're happy to be part of a disabled people's organisation. We ask them what their access needs are. We don't ask people to be referred or to sign a big medical form or anything like that. So it is about people identifying themselves as disabled people and being happy with that. We're an organisation for other DPOs, so other disabled people's organisations in and around Glasgow, and we see ourselves as a community of interest, so a community of disabled people supporting each other and with shared identities and shared interests and shared experiences. As well as supporting disabled people directly, we also work in co-production and with partners to make the world a better place for disabled people, to help them identify the barriers within their own organisation and to work with disabled people to develop solutions together. And our overall vision is that disabled people should be able to participate in their own lives, in their families and in their communities, and be visible across all aspects of society with the support they need and with choices equal to other people. And primarily what we do is that we're a learning organisation. We provide free accessible learning opportunities for disabled people to get together for mutual peer support and learning. So because a lot of that work has been face-to-face, you can imagine that in the past few months, we've just not been able to do that. So what we've done, so this was up to the 12th of June. So from the very beginning of lockdown to the middle of June, we'd actually made 4,500 wellbeing check-in calls. So we decided that we would phone every single one of our members, and we're gradually, we're nearly at the end of the list. And in some people, we've been checking over and over again. We've sent out 15,000 letters and informations in the post because we recognise that a lot of people are not online, and for some people that's the only way they get information. We've had 2,000 detailed responses to our survey at that point, and it's many more now. And we set up a new wellbeing service to help people with their mental health and physical wellbeing during lockdown, and at that point 100 people had been directly supported by that. We had delivered over 500 food packages to people. That's now over 1,000. And we'd supported people with welfare rights, around 100 people. So what's interesting maybe for this group is that 200 learners had participated in online sessions and discussion groups at that point in June, and it's many more now. And 1,500 hours of disabled people's voices had been heard speaking about their experiences and concerns. And because of the fact that we found out quite quickly that disabled people were far more digitally excluded than even we had imagined, we'd managed to receive some support money from the government in relation to digital inclusion. And we have set up a digital inclusion project where we've been delivering devices to people and supporting them on a one-to-one basis to be able to learn how to use those devices. So up till the middle of June, 345 people had received support calls in terms of using their own devices or receiving devices that we'd supplied with them, and 149 were receiving regular coaching or equipment to get online. So from the middle of June, these results are from the middle of June. We're just about to publish our results to the end of July. So from the end of June, we discovered that more than half the people were worried about food, medication, getting money, access to their money and things like this. One of the things that's really important for yourselves is that we found that 80% of disabled people in Greater Glasgow were not aware of the local services or support that they could access during lockdown. And and there was hundreds and hundreds of local support and services that were just popped up from local communities, loads and loads of fantastic support and services, but 80% of disabled people didn't know what they were or how to access them, or both. And that's because we found that over 60% of people struggled to get the information that they need. Over 60% of people were digitally excluded, and many people didn't have any sort of device. We support disabled asylum seekers and refugees, as well as people who live in extreme poverty. And some of those people didn't have as much as a television, never mind a mobile phone or a computer on an iPad or so on. So we found a huge proportion of disabled people who struggled to get access to any information. Obviously, loads of people were worried about isolation and physical and mental health. So basically what we found was that we've used this phrase that COVID-19 supercharged the inequalities that were already being faced by disabled people, and some of the pandemic responses created even new inequalities and left disabled people behind. So what we're trying to look to support organisations and government is that any sort of recovery and renewal risks leaving disabled people even further behind unless we actually supercharge the involvement of disabled people at every step of the way. So basically that's what this discussion today is around. It's about giving you some hints and tips as to how to do that. I can't possibly cover everything, but I'll cover as much as I possibly can, and we'll obviously share the slides and some further information with you afterwards. So we were going to set you up into some small discussions so that you can introduce yourselves to each other, have a little bit of a discussion about any issues and barriers you're facing when seeking to support disabled people to engage or attend and participate in your services, activities and meetings and so on. And also, is there anything in particular that you'd like to ask about, or do you have a specific barrier or problem that you'd like help with? And as I said, I can't promise I can solve it today, but I'll do my best to mention it. And one thing that's important is that I'm using the phrase disabled people, but you can think about any disadvantaged group of people when you're talking about supporting people today. So anybody who may be disadvantaged or excluded or not engaging in your services, because we look at it from the point of view that when you make things accessible to disabled people, you're likely to make it accessible to everyone. So I think the colleagues from the Eden Project are going to split you into groups at this point. So you'll find yourselves in a discussion group. And as I said, that's what we'd like you to think about. And questions in the chat as well. So I'm just going to go back to sharing my screen if that's okay. Okie doke. I just wanted to say a little bit about the social model of disability, which is a different way of defining disability and looking at disabled people and the experience that they have. So we use a social or a rights model analysis of disability, which means that we describe the barriers that disabled people face rather than the conditions, the medical conditions that, sometimes people call that the disabilities that people have. So basically what we look at is that we're disabled by the environment round about us. It's not our medical conditions or our impairments that actually disabled us, but it's the structures and the barriers in the world round about us. So basically disabled people are contending with poor physical access, attitude barriers, exclusion, discrimination, poverty, and the lack of support that we need to be able to take part in an equal basis as with non-disabled people. So putting it really simply, that if we designed the world around us a bit more effectively, or we involve disabled people in making decisions about design, then the world would not be as disabling. The world wouldn't be as full of barriers that we have to contend with. So basically, in terms of communications, events and learning activities, we need to consider what actually disables people rather than the conditions that we have. So when you think about it as barriers, you think about it as barriers that you can remove or reduce or prevent in the first place. So when you're thinking about working with disabled people in any capacity, but particularly with events and learning, think about all the different types of barriers that might come, present themselves, and then you can think about how to remove, reduce or prevent those barriers in the first place. So quite often disabled people are seen as a group of people as that are hard to reach, and that goes for lots of other groups of people, so other people who are traditionally disadvantaged. But we would suggest that that's not the case. They're not necessarily hard to reach, but they are maybe more easy to ignore. So how would we include rather than ignore people? So the first issue is that how do you communicate with people in the first place? So I've got a few slides around social media, but this applies to any sort of communication. So basically, in terms of social media, less is more. It sounds really obvious, but quite often in social media, there's a huge sort of emphasis on getting as much information as quickly as possible to people. But actually, people will take on board much more information if you share less of it, and maybe more frequently or whatever. But less is definitely more, whether that's the information or whether that's a visual piece of information and so on. In terms of hashtags, so hashtags obviously make information easy to find, but it also helps people to collate information. And sometimes it's about connecting with a particular campaign, for example. And very often what you see in hashtags is, you know, several words put together, but unless you capitalise the first letter of each word, not only are they more difficult to read and to understand, but if you're a visually impaired person using a screen reader, your screen reader reads it all as one word. Whereas if you put capital letters in, the screen reader for a visually impaired person will read it as separate words. So one of the easiest things I can implore you to do from today onwards is just to always remember to capitalise the first letter of each word in a hashtag. That would make a huge difference to many, many people. Subtitles on any films and BSL, British Sign Language, and whenever possible. And we recognise that British Sign Language can sometimes be really expensive and really difficult to produce. And because we're a disabled people's organisation, we think about these things from the beginning. When we put in funding bids, we build in those access costs in the funding applications right at the beginning, but recognise that not everybody can do that. But one thing people can do is put subtitles on all of your films, because that enables so many more people to understand what's going on and to get the information. And again, embedded hyperlinks within the text are just easier for screen readers to use. So if you give descriptions of the link, people will know that's going to be useful to them. So for example, there's two there. So it says, this page from Inclusion Scotland contains a lot of tips on accessible social media. So that is itself a hyperlink. So that's much more useful to someone than just saying, click here for information, and given a huge big hyperlink, or given a short URL where you've shortened the hyperlink. So again, just something to think about. The next thing is about images. So using clear, simple images with no text over photographs, and using a good contrast of text to background. So there's a picture here that I took from something that was a fantastic service that was in Glasgow during lockdown. And I've only picked this one because it's one of the first ones that I had on the list of bad examples. Brilliant organisation, a small community organisation linked to a parish church, doing a fantastic service, but that poster advertising that service is completely inaccessible to many, many people. The font itself is too small, and it's not an accessible font. It's the contrast between the colours is not accessible, and there's a picture behind the text, so it makes it even more difficult to read. And not only that, when that was on social media, there was no text description. So if you were a visually impaired person, you would have just got, there's an image here, but none of the information. So just, again, think about things like that. On the right-hand side, I've put an example of a Twitter post where we are putting in alt text, alternative text. So if you put image descriptions on all photographs and images, that means that someone who's using a screen reader will be able to understand that image. And quite often the images are actually conveying the key messages within the piece of information that you're trying to put out there. So it's really, really important that you put alternative text, alt text on all images or photographs. And if it's an image that just is a pretty pattern or a flower or something like that, you can just say image of a flower, or image to illustrate, you know, it's not illustrating a point, that's fine, but please put alt text on any images that you're using in social media. So in terms of publication, so this again would be any type of publication in terms, you know, written and printed, published information, or documents that you're producing. These are only some very, very simple basics. There's a whole host of things that you can do to make your publications more accessible. First of all, sounds really obvious, clear, easy to understand language, using lots of white space so that people don't get confused with too many words or overwhelmed, particularly if their reading skills are not great. If you left align the text rather than centre and justifying it, it means that, again, it's much easier to read, and it's easier for a screen reader to read. If you're going to use pictures to illustrate a point being made, that's fantastic, but use them in an accessible way. So don't just put random pictures in to make something look nice. Think about what that picture's saying, what images it has in it, and making sure that you're illustrating the points. And if it's a PDF document, you can also put alt text in documents as well, and print it in documents that people are going to read online. You can also use formatting to assist the screen readers. So for example, using headings, line spacing and so on within a document makes it much easier for a screen reader to read. And it also looks more consistent if you do it that way as well, which helps people to understand the document. If you're able to produce documents in multiple formats, so that would be Braille, easy read, audio versions and so on, please try to make them available at the same time as the standard formats, because quite often people who need alternative formats are having to wait quite a long time to receive those, and sometimes by the time they get the information it's already out of date. On the links that we're going to send you after this, there's the Scottish Accessible Information Forum has lots of useful information and advice, and I'm sure there's many similar organisations throughout the rest of the country, but that's one that I know of that I can recommend. In terms of online meetings, again, these are just some basics. Pick your platform well. So basically you've got platforms such as Zoom, Teams, WebEx, there's obviously live streaming and so on. And different platforms have different features. So take time to get to know them, pick the right one for your needs, for whatever it is that you're trying to do. Teams, for example, is Microsoft Teams. It's good for small meetings, it's good for people who know each other and who are connecting with each other on a regular basis, such as a work team, for example. Webinars are quite good, but webinars don't necessarily allow the participants to interact with each other in the same way. So sometimes that feels quite passive as someone, you know, as a viewer. Sometimes that's appropriate and sometimes it's not. Zoom is good for training sessions, but some features might need a little bit of a workaround to become more accessible. An example of that is that you can use closed captions or subtitles to make it easier for deaf or hard of hearing people to understand what's going on, and that's also useful for other people to follow what's going on. But when you use closed captions or subtitles in Zoom, it doesn't produce those automatically. So you have to have someone typing in what someone's saying, or you can use a third-party app that you would basically have to build in, which transfers all the text, all the speech to text. So that's a bit of a faff, but actually it's something that you can think about, which does make it easier for some people to participate. You can obviously record the video and you can produce transcripts, which means that people can watch it later on and can review the information, and it increases their understanding and their memory and so on. We can obviously use breakout rooms, as we've done already today, which gives people a break from the main session, gives people time to chat a bit more, give them an opportunity to get to know each other informally and so on. You can also obviously use interpreters such as BSL and language interpreters, and they can obviously join in the call. And the options vary for different platforms and how you can use that. And again, like I said before, build in the cost for that, you know, when you're thinking about the funding that you're going to need to produce something, whether it's a face-to-face event or whether it's an online event. We've been using sign language interpreters and note takers during our large meetings to enable people to take part. It's been a bit hit and miss as to how that works, but we're persevering with it and we're becoming more and more skilled at that as time goes on. One of the things to point out on Zoom is that there is a translator option on Zoom. So just as in the same way that you have breakout rooms, you can actually use a translator function, which basically means that someone who's using a language interpreter, they get a notification that the language interpreter is available and they link to each other, which means that as the person speaking, so like I'm obviously speaking today, the language interpreter would be translating that as a live translation, and no one else can hear that apart from the person who needs that particular language. However, while that's a great function on Zoom, when you go in to set that up on Zoom, there's a drop-down menu of languages that you can pick, and they're very, very limited. And you can't overwrite them. So we've had to tell people who are looking for an Arabic interpreter, for example, that they're going to have to pick German on the list. And we've had to have people who want to use the BSL interpreter to look for French on the list, because the languages that are there on the list are very limited. So we are feeding back to the CEO at Zoom that that's something that they may want to think about changing. Again, similarly to that, if you were on a webinar, you can spotlight the speaker plus other speakers, so you can have a panel of speakers that everyone can be looking at the same time. On Zoom, you can only spotlight one person at a time, although individual people on the call can pin the video of another person that they want to be able to connect with and make sure that they see them at all time. And you could do that for a BSL interpreter, but that means that the person needs to know how to do that. And that could be something that's technically beyond some of the people that's on your call. So it's just something to think about. And then obviously things like meeting etiquette. So people switching off their mic if they're not speaking means that there's not, any background noise and reduces the echo and things like that. It means that people can tune into the person who's speaking. You can obviously hide your video because some people might not want to be seen, but also it can be quite distracting if there's lots of people going, doing things in the background. It can be really, really distracting. And the other thing is to moderate the chat function, because sometimes when people are trying to concentrate and all the chat keeps popping up, it can be quite distracting and quite difficult for people to follow what's going on, because it becomes quite, as I said, quite distracting. And in particular, people who use screen readers, for example, the screen reader may be describing everything that's going on. So while they're trying to tune in and listen to the person speaking, the screen reader may be also reading out the chat at the same time. So they're getting multiple informations coming through. So when I deliver face-to-face sessions, I would never assume that anybody and everybody on the call, in the audience, can hear what I'm saying or understand what I'm saying or see any visuals that I'm using. So think really carefully around that. So same online. If you think visually, think about visual aspects. So describing what's going on all the time, reading all the text that you're using, acknowledging people's contributions and those waiting to speak, because they may not necessarily see that you nod at them or wave at them or whatever. So acknowledging that someone's waiting to speak or making a contribution. It's also quite frustrating if you're at a conference or an event and someone keeps saying things like, as you'll see on screen, whatever. If you're visually impaired, you can't see what's on the screen. So if what's on the screen is relevant and necessary and important for the audience to be able to see, it's necessary, relevant and important for you to read out, so that someone who's visually impaired or someone who's just at the back of the room or who doesn't have a great video on screen, sometimes people just can't see things. So it's really important. Thinking about the sound that people are using. So again, as I said, some people using screen readers may be hearing descriptions of everything that's going on. They can obviously switch that off, but if they switch that off, they then may be missing certain things. Some people may be overwhelmed by all the audio that's going on and may struggle to concentrate. So for example, some autistic people might really struggle with so much information overload. And some people find it easier if everyone on the call can use headphones and a microphone, because it cuts down on the background noise and makes it much easier to listen to what's going on without any interference, and it makes the sound clearer sometimes as well. And likewise, people may need a break just to get away from the information overload. It can be really exhausting being on Zoom, as some of you probably know. If you're like me and you have days where you're literally on Zoom in meetings all day, every day, it's really, really exhausting. So again, things like thinking about any sort of background noise and stuff like that is really important in terms of sound. So thinking about the information. So some people may need that information in advance. It's particularly if it's a session that you're teaching something to people. Some people may really welcome that information in advance because they may want to be able to take on board and process it, and they might take longer to do that. If it's someone who's visually impaired and you're going to be referring to a website, for example, and using a lot of online live web links, you might want to send them those web links in advance, because rather than following you on a screen, doing that as part of the online call, they might want to do that themselves because they can probably navigate that more effectively themselves if they're using any sort of software to do that. Facilitating discussions is also quite important because it gives everybody a chance to have their say and contribute. And again, this sounds really, really obvious, but sometimes on a Zoom meeting or an online meeting, it's not always obvious when someone wants to speak, or if someone wants to speak. You often get people all kind of jumping in at the same time trying to speak and things like that. And again, if you're visually impaired or a little bit shy or whatever, you're not necessarily going to pick up the cues or see that it's time for you to speak. So having someone to facilitate conversations is always really useful. Be creative, make the sessions fun and try something new. Again, quite obvious, but actually we've tried things online that have worked and some that haven't worked so well. Next week we're going to be trying some cookery lessons online. So normally face-to-face those can work really well. But we've had to think about things like obviously giving people all the ingredients in advance, but some people can't get the ingredients, so we're having to buy ingredients and get them to people so that they can take part in the cookery sessions. Not everybody's going to be able to have their laptop or their tablet set up in their kitchen, so they're not necessarily going to be able to cook along with it in the way that we would do if it was a face-to-face class. So we're having to think of all sorts of different ways to make things as fun and inclusive as possible. And lastly, building in breaks to prevent eye strain or overloading people is really important if you're going to have a long online meeting. Does anyone have any questions so far? I'm aware that I've spoke for a wee while yet.
Marianne, just looking at the chat, we had 2 questions about the best formatting. I assume this is more specific on fonts and stuff. And there was also a question around the best app for taking captions, and just to reassure people, we will share the presentation so that you can go back to that in your own time later on as well.
Okay, in relation to the different apps for captions, what we'll do is we can put them in the notes that come after this, just some links to it. It would be useful if anybody on the chat here, on the session here rather, has used a caption service. We've actually had, what we've done is, because we have a relationship with an organisation where we provide British Sign Language and electronic note takers, we've actually used the electronic note takers that we normally would have for conferences, meetings and events. So we've not used an app as such, because we've got a relationship already with our electronic note-taking team. So basically they're like the people who would transcribe, you know, like in a court case, for example. So they're literally typing, that's their job on the day, is to do that, and they're very good at it. So we've chosen to use that route rather than an app, because not all apps are great at capturing everybody's voices, particularly if they have different accents or speak in different ways. But if anybody here today has got an app that they want to recommend, please do so, and we'll include it in the notes that everybody gets after today. So yeah, in terms of formatting, I think that it's things like using headers and line spacing rather than using the return key, because if you have a document where you're trying to space things out, and if you keep using the return key, someone who is visually impaired using a screen reader, their screen reader will read all those returns. So it'll be, you know, like a heading, for example, and then it'll be space, or return, you know, that's what their screen reader will be reading out to them. So if you can use the formatting that's available in Microsoft Word or your word processing document, it makes it much easier. So you can set a heading. So basically a screen reader would say heading, online meeting the basics, for example, and then it'll miss out the spaces if you've done it as a line space rather than as a return. And I realise that's quite technical, but there is information in the links that we're going to send. There's information about what this means and how to do that afterwards. So I hope that answers a few of the questions so far. Okay, so I also just put in a couple of slides again around online, facilitating groups and learning sessions. And these apply obviously in terms of face-to-face as well as online sessions. So one of the easiest ways to engage people who are not currently engaged is to think about, are they involved in the development, design and delivery of the learning or the activity? So if you try to involve people in the development, the design and the delivery, then they're probably more likely to want to come and take part. And it's quite empowering for disabled people to see themselves as the presenters, or to be involved in discussions around what's going to happen and how it's going to happen and so on. And quite often we're as disabled people, we can be quite passive recipients of services or of learning and so on. We're not always seen as someone who someone who has the expertise or someone who can provide advice and so on. So actually having disabled people or other marginalised groups involved in the development, design and delivery is one way to engage people more effectively. It also means that it also means that the content and the all the other things like the venue, the time and the access considerations will be discussed at that development stage with the people that where those things really matter. So thinking about lots of variety of delivery and participation methods. So quite often at GDA we're delivering sessions where there are multiple people in the room with lots of different impairments, people with learning difficulties, for example, or people with hearing and visual impairments, autistic people and so on. So people who have all sorts of communication and support needs. So we use as many different methods as we possibly can. And we use lots of different methods to record what's going on and to feedback what's going on and to give people an opportunity to participate. So, for example, when I'm delivering sessions with young disabled people, we might have a topic that we're discussing and we might ask them to think about, what that topic means. So some people in a group may want to discuss that. Some people may want to draw a picture or make a poster about it. Some people may want to just create another piece of artwork or some other way to communicate. So we would give people the options on how best to take on the information, but also how best to discuss it and feed it back to us. And we would always say to be mindful of hidden literacy issues, which is not something that's obviously relevant just to disabled people, but to the whole community. So hidden literacy issues and communication barriers are quite often they're quite often present and you don't necessarily know about it. So again, going back to reading out everything that's presented on screen, audio describing what's going on in films and any sort of background work. And having some support available when possible, and making that support discreet if you can. So for example, that might include things like if you've got personal assistants or carers there to help people to take part, asking them not to turn up in a uniform so that everybody knows that that's there's the nurses in the corner or the care staff are in the corner or whatever. So if people can just, we always say, people don't turn up in a uniform if they're helping. And also thinking about other discrete things. I was at a conference once and I'd said in the notes that if during lunch I need a seat, I can't sit down, I can't stand up and talk to people and juggle all these cups and plates and things like that. So I said I would like a seat. So what they'd done was everybody else was standing, but they put this seat in the corner for me to sit on. And somebody at the woman who was organising the conference said, "Oh, I've got you a seat," and she sat me in the corner. And then she quickly noticed that I was sitting in the corner, but everybody else was standing around in huddles talking to each other. And she literally announced over the microphone, "Can someone go and talk to Marianne, please, because she can't stand and talk. So if you could go and speak to her, that would be really lovely." And you can imagine how I felt at that moment in time. But actually what happened was people did come to speak to me, but what they said was, "Oh, I wish I had a seat as well, because I'm really, I'd like a seat right now. It's much more comfortable to sit and chat or sit and have your cup of tea and not have to balance a plate and a cup and all that while you're trying to grab lunch." So yeah, being discreet would be really helpful. Other sort of literacy issues might be the fact of, or communication issues may be that some people are hard of hearing and don't know it, or don't want to tell anybody about it. So thinking about the lighting in the room is really important as well, so that people can actually see someone's face when they're speaking, so that if anyone's lip reading, they'll be able to do that. That's again something that's not necessarily very obvious. It's really important for you to tell people that your activity is going to be accessible. Again, it sounds really obvious, but if you don't tell people that it's going to be accessible to them, they'll assume that it's not, because that is their normal. That's our normal as disabled people. And we don't want to always have to be the one that phones you up to ask if it's accessible, or has to do the research on a venue if it's accessible, or find out if the toilets are going to be accessible, or if there's going to be parking, or if you're going to give information in different formats and so on. So please tell people what you can provide and what to expect, and be honest about that. So it's fine to say this venue is wheelchair accessible, but unfortunately there's not an accessible toilet, because some people may be okay with that. So be honest, but please do tell us if something's accessible, particularly if you've gone to great lengths to make it accessible. So we often hear that people don't, we've tried to do all these things and people haven't turned up. Well, did you tell them that you've done all those things? Because if you haven't, as I said, we as disabled people will assume it's not accessible, because that's what our normal is. So just a quick accessible inclusive events checklist. Again, this is not absolutely everything, but it's some of the key things. So this obviously applies to face-to-face events. This is the type of support and considerations that we at GDA would have. So making sure that a venue has level access, that it's got accessible toilets plus level access ordinary loos. A changing places toilet would be fabulous if it's available. And you can quite often get mobile changing places toilets on hire to larger venues if that's appropriate. And those are toilets that have got hoists and changing beds in them as well. Having some quiet space, so people who need to take time out can go and take some quiet time away. Thinking about the distance and having a larger space than you would normally have. One good thing about social distancing or physical distancing is that for disabled people, we normally would say we need a much larger space. There's nothing worse than being a wheelchair user or someone on crutches trying to navigate a very, very tight, narrow space. Whereas at least with social or physical distancing, if people have to be at least 1 metre or 2 metres apart, that will help some disabled people to be in a venue. Thinking about the timings, making them flexible, accommodating people's social care needs or their stamina or their cognitive ability. We always provide transport to our events, even if it's a very local event, because many disabled people still find public transport completely inaccessible and wouldn't necessarily have a car or be able to afford a taxi. So we do provide taxi transport to all of our events when we have them face to face. Again, that's something to think about in terms of funding applications. We always have personal assistance, so that could be very low level stuff, such as helping people with their jackets or getting them a cup of tea, right through to very intimate personal care around helping people to eat or to go to the toilet and so on, and with reading and writing. We would always provide communication support, so that would be things like BSL to English interpreters, ENTs as electronic note takers, personal assistants to support people, and language interpreters if necessary. We provide all of our information in a variety of formats, so MP3 audio, Braille, large print, electronic versions, videos have BSL, and tactile information when that's appropriate too. And again, we build the cost of those into our funding applications. Valuing and recognising people's contributions, making sure people get feedback and are given ongoing updates and reviews. And simply, the simplest way is to ask people what they need. Ask people what they need to make the session accessible to them. So put it to people, if you tell us what you need, we'll do our best to meet that need. Is a really helpful conversation that you can have with people. And like I said, be honest about what you can provide and what you can't provide. So that's the you know what I thought I'd put together as some kind of accessible and inclusive events checklist. But we're going to send some links to further information to help people just think through in terms of events ongoing as well. So with that in mind, we wanted to give you the opportunity to again just think about in your discussion groups, thinking about the stuff that I've mentioned. Is there anything that was particularly interesting or helpful? And hopefully there's something that's interesting or helpful to you. And is there any actions that you could take forward to help in your own organisation in terms of becoming more inclusive, in terms of information provision or delivering events, and particularly online events? Or is there any other information that you want to hear about that we can tell you today, any questions, or we can put in the information that we share afterwards? So I'll hand back over to the Eden Project colleagues for the breakout rooms.
Great, so we should have everyone back with us. So back over to you, Marianne.
Okie doke. Does anybody want to share anything from their group discussion, or does anybody have any questions?
Yes, I'd like to share. Hello, it's Edward here. I'd like to share some feedback from our breakout group. Because we were talking about accessibility to services and equipment, etc., and the barriers that are there. One of the examples I used was where maybe a visually impaired person may need a braille display for a computer, and in order to access information on a computer. But the difficulty is that equipment can be quite expensive, and sometimes organisations are quite unwilling to spend a large amount of money on, say if they spend like £2,000 on a braille display, but there's only one person able to use it. It might be seen as unfeasible and to struggle to justify that kind of expense, and that in some cases. And also people, in my case, I help people with benefits. I'm a benefits advisor. And one of the things that I do advise people is to claim the relevant benefits, such as personal independence payments, and maybe use that money to buy your own adaptive equipment or software or whatever to help with your disability, which can help you access more information rather than just depending on so many other organisations where you may need help and support that can't provide the level of support you need.
Yep, absolutely, Edward. A lot of the technology is really expensive, and things like using BSL interpreters is really expensive. And that's what, as I said, we tend to build all those kind of costs as much as possible into our funding applications. What we then hear from funders is, why are your access budgets so high? Other organisations don't have those sorts of costs, and we say, well, other organisations aren't providing the level of support that we're providing. So actually, it would help everybody if more people put those costs into their funding applications at the beginning, because funders would then get a sense of the real costs of involving people who are currently excluded from services and supports. So the more people who acknowledge that in their funding applications, it would really help just to make funders more aware, because we're constantly being, kind of come back, funders constantly come back to us asking us to justify so many such high costs for these things. And one thing just to mention that people may not be aware of is that if the disabled person is working in paid employment for any length of time, Access to Work is a government scheme from DWP which provides support for the costs of equipment and for things like transport to and from work, but also equipment that people may need. And many disabled people don't actually know that. And many organisations that employ disabled people or would potentially employ disabled people don't know that as well. So just a wee plug for Access to Work as well.
Yeah.
Is there anybody else?
Right.
There was a few people waving. Was it Joe? Sorry, Joe.
Hello.
Hi, Joe.
Everybody hear me? There's been a little bit of an issue with my sound. Can you hear me, Diana?
Just about.
Hold on. Oh, I'm at maximum volume. Right. Okay, so I did about 100 years ago, I did a degree in deaf studies at Wolverhampton, and all the see-hear interpreters were doing the interpreting course, and I was on the other half, and essentially we were looking at the medical model versus the social model, and the medical model essentially leaves the deaf, hard of hearing, deafened person, deaf with a capital D or not, with a feeling of incompleteness. You know, there's a famous film Mandy, where and this was the case right up until the 80s, where the education of deaf children was interrupted. They were made to sit on their hands. No sign language. They were dragged out of their classes at random times to see the speech therapist. So, and it was really important to, you know, very famous thing where she's going pee, puh, puh, and she's got a balloon in front of her mouth. You know, and she's trying to move the balloon with her breath, and essentially it's just, you know, you kind of, the problem with the deaf community is it's not literally a genetic you know, essentially you have deaf children born to hearing parents, and the percentage of deaf children born to deaf parents is approximately 2% of that population. And it's a little bit like, you know, comparing it to the people who speak Welsh and those who understand, you know. So it's kind of, you know, there are parallels, but I have to say that I found your checklist amazing, and I'm blown away.
Thank you. It's a very small checklist. I will send some. Sorry, I'm getting feedback from. Thank you. So basically, I will include. There's a couple of slides I'm not going to show today, like just now, but they're the slides that have got links to other documents that have got other checklists and information on them. So I think the reason that we can do that is because we're a disabled people's organisation, so we're working from our own barriers. So when we set up the organisation as disabled people, we thought about, well, what excludes us and what can we do to make sure that other people like us are not excluded. And then when more and more disabled people join the conversations, we then learned about other disabled people's needs and other disabled people's barriers. And so we just keep, you know, moving on that way. I'm just aware of the time. I need to hand back over to the Eden project in just a wee minute.
I think, Marianne, there was a question in the chat, which I think is quite relevant possibly for quite a few people who run, say, community projects on a shoestring, sometimes even without any budget or funding as such. So what are your top tips on how to make things, online activities, accessible on a shoestring?
I think that, like I said, if you're using things like Zoom, for example, get to know it really, really well yourself, so that you can help people to make it accessible for them. So one of the things we were talking about while you were in the breakout rooms is that people may not know how to pin the video. So just in case anybody here doesn't know how to do it, you just pick a speaker, which could be myself or someone, and if you look at their the top right hand side of the screen, there's 3 little dots, and if you click on that, one of the options is pin video. So what it means is, when I was doing my slides at the beginning, and if you were having to lip read me, for example, or if I was a sign language interpreter, you pin the video so that when you see the slides, rather than having a list of people and trying to find the person you're looking for, that person's pinned at the top of the list or at the front of the list so that you always see them. And that's really, really helpful for people who need to follow those kind of things. So I would definitely say get to know your platform really, really well. I would say ask people what they need. And sometimes disabled people, we're all very resourceful and we can sometimes come up with our own solutions. So asking people what would work for them and doing your best to work together to provide a solution. Get to know your local community as well, because actually you might find that in your community there's a disability or deaf organisation that could help you to come up with some solutions. But I suppose the thing is to just keep trying, try your best. And I think some of the frustrations is that people are not necessarily aware of what the barriers are, and I think the more you can familiarise yourself with the barriers, the more you can try to address them. So I think it's that whole thing about what I said at the beginning is don't think about people as being hard to reach, think about them as being easy to ignore, and actually if you get to know those group of people, you're less likely to ignore them. And to be honest and say, you know, we can't afford to provide BSL interpreters, but is there another way that we could make this more accessible for you? Or we can't afford to have, certain whatever it is that the person needs. But I think the main thing is people will really appreciate you asking and trying to come up with a solution rather than just avoiding it. And obviously one of the things is trying to think about any time at all when you are putting in a funding application, try and put in the cost of providing some of this support and making those budgets as flexible as possible. So on my watch, we've got 4 minutes. So I don't know if you want to jump in, Eden Project now, or...
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Marianne. I believe just to reassure everyone again, we will share the presentation, we will share an edited version of this video, and also I think Marianne will include a few more checklists and more links and where you can find more resources as well. And I guess she will also possibly share her contact details, so if you have any follow-up questions, she might be able to put you in the right direction. I must say I learned so much myself, so thank you. Thank you so much for coming on with us today, Marianne. And just to say that we have a little survey which doesn't take longer than 3 to 5 minutes, just about this session and in general our online session. So to just give us some feedback of not only the session today, but also possibly on what other sessions you would like to see or would be helpful for us to organize for you guys in the future. I believe Lucy she just put in the link in the chat right now, so you can click on there, and then after you left the meeting, you can always then later on take the survey in your own time. We would appreciate that. And yes, I think that is pretty much it. So yeah, thanks again everyone for joining, and we hope to see you soon at some of our future online events, which we are working on improving and making more accessible, thanks to all the great information we got today. So thanks everyone.
Thanks everybody. Thank you. It's really nice.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.